Welcome to the Edexcel 9 to 1 Speaking Exam Guide to the Higher Tier in German. Your speaking exam will consist of 3 parts. Firstly, a role play, worth 10 marks. Secondly, a picture-based task, worth 24 marks. And finally, a conversation across 2 topics, one of which you are able to choose, which is worth 36 marks. The speaking examination will not last more than 24 minutes. Your first 12 minutes will be in preparation and you will be supervised. You will be given 2 cards and these will not overlap with the topic that you have chosen to start with for your conversation. The 2 cards will be a role-play task and a picture-based task. You will not be allowed access to dictionaries or reference materials during this time. However, you may make notes. This is to be no more than 1 A4 side and will need to be handed in after you perform the picture-based task in the examination. Also worth noting that the guidelines state that you should not be reading from the notes that you have made during your preparation time. They should just be there to assist you and remind you what it is you wanted to say. You will start your speaking examination with the role play. Possible scenarios for the role play are illustrated here. For example, meeting an exchange family for the first time, attending your exchange partner's school, going shopping, booking accommodation, asking for food or a table at a cafe or restaurant, applying for a job, asking for directions, arranging an outing, for example, a cinema, and dealing with problems. This is an example of what a foundation role-play card will look like. You will have a few minutes to prepare this card, make notes if you need to, and it will give you a chance to think about what you might have to say and also what the unexpected question may be. So, the scenario will always be presented to you. For example, you are talking to a waiter in a restaurant. The teacher will always start the conversation, so you will need to wait until then before you start on number 1. The role-play card will always tell you what mode of address you should be using, whether it's du or Sie. In this case, it is Sie, so please make sure you use haben Sie, möchten Sie. Make sure you take a note of where there is a question mark. That's where you are going to have to actually ask a question. And also where there is an exclamation mark. It is always on number 3. And that is where you are going to have to answer a question that you have not had a chance to prepare. But as I say, during your preparation time, you can then think about what sort of things you may get asked. This is what the teacher actually sees. The teacher's words, which cannot be changed at all, appear here in bold. The teacher is not allowed to rephrase or paraphrase at all, but if you need something repeated, you can say, Wie bitte? The unexpected questions usually appear at number 3. There is one sample card where this is not the case. The questions at foundation tier will always be in the present tense. And this is how the whole role play may look. The teacher's role is on the left-hand side, and the candidate's role, or an example of what the candidate might say, is on the right-hand side. This is the marking scheme for the role play. There are 10 marks available, 2 marks for each utterance. What you're aiming for is for 2 marks for each utterance. Your statements and questions should be clearly communicated, appropriate within the context of the role play, unambiguous, that means the meaning has to be absolutely clear, and the pronunciation should support clear communication. You can see that for 1 mark you may have an element of ambiguity or perhaps your pronunciation is not quite as good as it should be. I know it's only worth 10 marks, but they're really 10 very important marks, and you should be aiming for 10 out of 10 on this one. This is an example from the topic of daily life under identity and culture of what your picture-based task may look like. Again, you received this picture during your preparation period. You should read the instructions and start to prepare in your mind, or indeed make notes from which you cannot read, remember, but you can refer to, on the 5 bullet points. The teacher will once again start the conversation, and the first thing you will be asked to do is to describe the photograph. When you have finished that, the teacher may ask you for more details. Otherwise, the teacher will state an opinion and ask you what you think, and in this case it's going to ask you what your opinion about friendship is. Thirdly, you'll be asked a past tense question, and fourthly, you'll have a question in the future or in the conditional tense. And finally, you will have a question in the past tense. This is what the teacher examiner will see. You can see that the teacher examiner will start the conversation. Beschreib mir das Foto. Then, as we said, state an opinion, then ask you what you think. Ask you a question in the past tense. And it actually says, Erzähl mir davon. So that means really that you're going to have to give a little bit of detail, not just say what you did last weekend, but perhaps add an opinion, or add, maybe mention 2 or 3 things that you did and what was the best. Fourthly, what are you doing on the coming weekend? You can see that the question is actually in the future tense, so you would be required to answer in the future tense. And finally, another question. The brackets are actually what the teacher examiner can say to you if you haven't given enough detail. So, noch etwas, anything else, warum, why, warum nicht, if you just give an opinion, why not. The teacher examiner cannot say anything else. Those questions and those statements have to be read out the same for everybody doing that particular card. There are 24 marks in total available for the picture-based task. This is divided into communication and content, and then secondly 8 marks are awarded, or maximum of 8, for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. If we have a look at the marking scheme here, you can see that for 13 to 16 out of 16 you have to have frequently developed responses. You have to be able to effectively adapt language to describe, narrate and inform. So those 2 basically mean that you've got to say more than one thing, or give more than one detail for each of your 5 utterances, and that you need to give a little bit more than just a piece of information. You need to add some description. The 3rd bullet point on this marking scheme talks about giving opinions, and here not only giving your opinion but saying why and developing why as well. Your pronunciation and intonation should be intelligible, and everything that you say should be communicated, so it should be clear even if you are making the odd mistake. If you go to the 9 to 12 bracket, you'll see there is some development, some hesitation and some prompting needed from the teacher examiner because you don't give enough detail. You will have some effective adaptation of language, but you're still describing, so there still needs to be description in there. Though I've crossed it out with the blue line here, you've got to have occasional brief justification. So you will perhaps not go to a lot of detail about why you find something interesting, but it is you have a because or an although or something there anyway. And your pronunciation and intonation are intelligible. However, inaccuracies might sometimes stop all your meanings coming across. And then if you have a look at the 5 to 8, it's talking about much hesitation, some limited success, brief opinions without justification. So you can see how important it is to give as much detail as you can, as clearly as you can, with adjectives and becauses as well. Of the 24 marks, a maximum of 8 marks will be awarded for your linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So this is where how complicated what you say and how accurate it is taken into consideration. For 7 to 8 marks, it shows you that your grammatical structures need to be generally accurate and that you have to have generally successful references to past, present and future events. There may be occasional ambiguity, which means that occasionally one might have to think really carefully about what you said and to which time frame you are referring. It says responses are generally coherent, although errors occur. So that's for 7 to 8 marks, and for most of you, I think that is actually achievable. For 5 to 6 marks, it says some accurate grammatical structures and some successful references to past, present and future events. So even for 5 to 6 marks, you may only get maybe present tense and past tense correct. Responses are partially coherent. Now that's an interesting statement. Partially coherent. Errors occur that sometimes hinder clarity of communication and occasionally prevent meaning being conveyed. So you could get maybe one of the questions a little bit muddled and not make your utterances quite so clear and still get 5 or 6 marks out of 8. Your conversation will cover 2 themes from the following: identity and culture, local area, holiday and travel, school, future aspirations, study and work, or international and global dimension. So, for the conversation there are 36 marks available. And actually, if you think about it, this is actually quite good, because in a way this is the most predictable part of the exam. You know what topics are going to come up, and you'll have ample opportunity to prepare and practice the questions that may indeed come up. The conversation will cover 2 themes. It is the teacher examiner's job to ensure that you spend roughly the same amount of time on each of the 2 themes. This part of the examination will not last more than 6 minutes. The candidate will choose which area they would like to start with. So, for example, of the theme school, you may choose to start with what school is like, and you may choose to start with talking about the school rules. You will be invited at the start of this part of the examination by the teacher to say which part of the theme you have chosen and why. This should not last more than 1 minute. The remaining up to 2 minutes you will spend exploring the rest of that theme. Then the teacher examiner will start a different theme. Of the 36 marks, 12 marks are given for communication and content. For this particular part of the marking scheme, the attention will be given to how much information is actually given during the course of the conversation across both topics. How creatively the candidate uses their language in giving ideas, thoughts and reasons behind their opinions. How varied the vocabulary is, perhaps there'll be some unusual vocabulary which could be given credit, and how good the pronunciation and intonation is. For the second part of the marking scheme, attention will be given to interaction and spontaneity, also worth 12 marks. Attention will be given to how quickly the candidate is able to answer the questions, how spontaneous they are, how they are able perhaps to initiate and develop the conversation, whether they can a sustained conversation throughout using rephrasing to continue the flow. And the third part of the marking scheme will deal with the linguistic knowledge and accuracy of the candidate's performance. So, attention will be given to how varied the grammatical structures used were. Is there complex word order, extended sentences, and more challenging language, for example? How accurate the tenses were, and of course you need to remember to keep using your tenses. And finally, how coherent what the candidate said is. For example, to get really good marks, you shouldn't have any major errors which prevent the teacher examiner, or indeed the person who marks your speaking, from actually understanding what it was you meant. This is the communication and content grid for the speaking conversation. Maximum of 12 marks. Okay, now we will need to look at this in more detail at a later stage because it is quite complicated. However, you can see how the marks are sort of graduated. So for 10 to 12 marks, it says occasionally uses language creatively to express some individual thoughts, ideas and opinions, some of which are justified. And then you go to the 7 to 9 where it says uses language to produce straightforward ideas, thoughts with occasional justification. And 4 to 6 it talks about limited justification when using language to produce straightforward ideas, thoughts and opinions. As I say, this needs an awful lot more detail, so it's worth just showing it now and showing you that this is something that we will be looking at a later stage. And on to the interaction and spontaneity grid, again worth 12 marks. For 10 to 12 you're going to have to answer spontaneously, that means fairly quickly, some questions, not necessarily all of them, but interacting naturally for some parts of the conversation. You should be able to initiate and develop the conversation independently with some prompting. That means you need to give some detail without being asked for it. And you are able to rephrase or use repair strategies to continue the conversation. For 7 to 9 marks, you are doing similar sorts of things, but it talks about occasionally rather than sometimes being able to do it. And this is the linguistic knowledge and accuracy grid, again worth 12 marks. For 10 to 12, you've got to manipulate grammatical structures with occasional variation. Complex structures might be used, but they may be a bit repetitive. Generally accurate grammatical structures, generally coherent speech, whereas the 7 to 9 talks about a limited variety of mainly straightforward grammatical structures with some accurate grammatical structures and some successful references to past, present or future. And again, there are sequences of coherent speech, although errors often occur that may hinder the clarity of communication. So in other words, again, you can make some mistakes. Some of your language may be difficult to understand, but still score up to 9 marks out of 12 for this section. So, to summarise, you can see from the mark schemes that the role play is marked for communication only, that in the picture-based task, communication is more important than linguistic knowledge and accuracy, and that during the conversation there are 3 areas which are assessed: communication and content with 12, interaction and spontaneity with 12, and linguistic knowledge and accuracy with 12. However, I am pretty convinced that if you prepare very, very thoroughly for this examination, you shouldn't find scoring upper marks in any of those particularly difficult.